Last week we spoke about the Wehrmacht struggles during the Rasputitsa. In the autumn of 1941, a rain-soaked road stitched Moscow to Leningrad, as two colossal armies walked a fever dream towards a grim deadline. On one side, German steel pressed for a swift clinch at Typhoon, and along the Smolensk-Moscow spine, on the other, Soviet resolve rebuilt from ruin. Civilians shoulder to shoulder with soldiers refused to quit. Mud and Rasputitsa swallowed tanks and trucks, turning battlefields into quagmires, while progress slowed to a wary crawl. The German lines stretched, with Beowulf's Baltic Gamble collapsing under determined Soviet resistance, while Soviet counteroffensives stitched defensive curtains around critical hubs like Typhoon and the Buildup corridor. Supplies faltered, airfields clogged, fuel ran low as winter loomed. Beowulf's island ambitions dissolved into hard lessons about logistics and distance. In Kiev and Kharkiv, the front's pressure persisted as Hitler's strategic visions collided with grim realities. This episode is The Wehrmacht Struggled in October Mud. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Eastern Front podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. So give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over at Echoes of War, I'm about to release a long-format podcast covering the entire Greco-Persian War and the Battle of the Philippines in 1941 to 1942. These are actually going to be found in full documentary form on my YouTube channel as well. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. On Monday, the 26th of October, a notable leadership shuffle occurred in the Soviet ranks. Stalin swapped the positions of Vaiduynsky and Kozin. Technically, Kozin outranked Vaiduynsky, and that hierarchy was cited as the official reason for appointing Kozin as the commander of the Leningrad front. But many historians suspect there was more under the surface. Some argue Stalin wanted a frontline fighter, someone with proof in mettle in combat, leading the 54th Army, which was coming under increasing threat. Vaiduynsky had earned a reputation as a capable and aggressive commander on the battlefield, a reputation that could be leveraged by placing him where his forward-facing leadership would be the most effective. This swap then might reflect a strategic alignment of personalities to match the demands of the moment rather than a simple matter of official rank. 2 days after the swap, the call to proceed with the second Sinyavino offensive was withdrawn. The German threat at Typhoon and in the surrounding approaches was draining vast portions of the 54th Army's strength, and the Soviet offensive effort was not making meaningful progress. With the 54th Army's line stretched, and the enemy pressing from multiple directions, the risk of encirclement grew, shifting the priority towards holding the line and preventing a collapse that could threaten the entire operational area around Leningrad and its supply routes. Despite that recalibration, Kozin was ordered to begin planning a fresh offensive at Sinyavino once the immediate German push was repelled. In other words, even as the frontline risk loomed, the strategic clock kept ticking towards a renewed push in the Salvino sector, where the geometry of the terrain and the timing of the German withdrawals was to shape the next phase of the battle. In addition to the leadership reshuffle, Stalin also reprimanded the commander of the 52nd Army on the 26th for a pattern of failures that kept undermining progress. With the German push towards Moscow blunted for the moment, Stavka could relocate reinforcements to other sectors of the theater, where they were needed the most. The 92nd Rifle Division and the 60th Tank Division were pulled from the Stavka reserves and sent to bolster defenses around Typhoon. It would take until the 30th for both formations to arrive in the front lines and become fully operational. But even as those reinforcements moved in, the early elements of the 60th Tank Division took part in an offensive on the 27th, alongside the 191st Rifle Division and elements of the 4th Guards Rifle Division. Their target was the vanguard of the German 12th Panzer Division near Sitomlia. Despite a clear numerical advantage, the attack failed to push the Germans back. In fact, the German force held firm long enough to halt and even begin regrouping. The broader picture remained the same. The 52nd and 4th Armies were advancing in fits and starts, their counterattacks hampered by coordination problems and incomplete preparation, which limited their impact on the battlefield. As the German center offensive was checked, trouble also brewed on the wings. On the southern flank, the Soviet 259th Rifle Division anchored the defensive line along the Malaya Wisla River, a boundary reinforced by the 288th and 267th Rifle Divisions. Together, these three divisions mounted a disciplined defense that blunted the advance of the German armored and mechanized spearheads, the 18th Motorized and 8th Panzer and 126th Infantry Divisions. By the 27th, the southern prong of the offensive had been abandoned, and the two mobile divisions received orders to pull north towards Sitomlia. The 126th Infantry Division remained behind, holding the front line. Up north, the drive of the 11th Infantry Division, north along the Volkhov River, ground to a halt north of Kirishi by the 28th. To bolster that sector, portions of the 21st Infantry Division were reassigned to strengthen the 11th. Those were the only reinforcements available, reflecting Leib's shortage of extra reserves. The relieved unit then received marching orders to move northeast along the Volkhov River line, a maneuver designed to shield the flank and the push towards Tikhvin and keep the German advance from turning the northern front. Scared by the slowing pace of the offensive, even on the 26th, Field Marshal von Leib sought permission from Hitler to cancel the planned assault on the Orenbaum bridgehead. That order would free up 3 more infantry divisions, allowing them to be redeployed to refresh the Tikhvin offensive. However, by moving these divisions into their new positions, it would take time, and the timing mattered. If Tikhvin finally fell, the implications for Leningrad and its surrounding pockets were quite stark. Soviet forces in Leningrad proper and at Orenbaum would be cut off from vital supplies, and they would face rapid starvation, effectively undermining the need for further costly assaults. There was also the hope that Finland might be drawn into the pressure, offering a distraction that could slow Soviet mobilization and further complicate their logistics. In the build-up to the Tikhvin offensive, German diplomacy with Finland had nudged Helsinki towards its own push towards the same objective. Yet Finnish Generalissimo Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim kept a tight rein on the timing, offering no firm set date. For the moment, Finland's army was consumed with its wider Karelia campaign. But Dvorzhygorsk stood as the main objective of 2 separate pushes from the south and the east, a sign of how the front was beginning to be pressed from multiple directions. By the 19th, Finnish forces had crossed the Suna River line, and they were creeping forward, albeit quite slowly. The two powers, the Finns and the Germans, were also talking about a joint operation towards Belomorsk, but Finland insisted that such a strike would hinge on a larger development, the fall of Leningrad. The reasoning behind this was quite straightforward. If Leningrad fell, it would remove a major pressure on Finnish forces and free them to shift northwards. Mannerheim estimated that he could dispatch 8 or 9 Finnish brigades once the city was secured. In their eagerness to renew efforts to sever the Murmansk Railway, the OKW and Hitler appeared to overlook this Finnish requirement, namely that Finland needed time and capacity to reassign its units before any joint action could be effective. The continuation war was exacting a harsh toll on Finland. Recruitment of half of its industrial workforce and a staggering 70% of its agricultural labor was strained to the limit. The year of 1941 would end with roughly 75,000 Finnish casualties, and it would keep resources flowing. Finnish divisions were condensed into brigades, with surplus manpower shifted back to civilian industry. Amidst this strain, Finland pressed for grain. 175,000 tons were sought to bridge the gap until harvests could be done in 1942. A strategic glimmer appeared when the Soviet leadership announced the start of plans to abandon the port of Hanko, announcing that on October the 23rd, an action that would alter naval and land considerations in the region. In a related redeployment move, the USSR began shifting garrison forces away from vulnerable posts towards Orenbaum, with the first transfer scheduled for October the 27th. Stavka had been tracking the faltering pace of the German offensive, and by the 29th they pushed for a bold corrective move. They ordered the Fourth Army to form 2 shock groups, setting the stage for a major counteroffensive to begin the following week. One shock group was formed at Sitomia from the 191st Rifle Division, a regiment drawn from the 44th Rifle Division, and a regiment pulled from the 60th Tank Division. The second shock group consisted of the 4th Guards Rifle Division, augmented by 2 regiments from the 60th Tank Division, and it was assembled about 25 kilometers south of Sitomia. In support, the 92nd Rifle Division was to be operating in the same area to lend additional manpower and firepower to the shock groups. The aim was clear: smash the German formations driving towards Tikhvin and restore the Soviet defensive line along the Volkhov River. Over in Moscow, General Zhukov's offensive pressed on against the southern flank of the Fourth Army and the 4th Panzer Group. Kleist pressed for the Army Group Reserve to be released, a request that by the 27th Bock was seriously weighing in. The 23rd and 268th Infantry Divisions stood as the only formation still uncommitted within Army Group Center, while Guderian's Panzer Army remained too distant to offer any timely support. Even as segments of the German line teetered towards collapse, the rest of Army Group Center stayed in motion. On the northern front, the 5th Army Corps seized Volokolamsk on the 27th. Consistent with Wehrmacht practice, once a goal was reached, planners reset their sights to an even more ambitious target: Klin, about 80 kilometers northeast of them. Yet rather than pressing immediately, the 4th Army was allowed to begin preparations to mount this offensive as soon as the ground froze enough for movement. The catch was fuel and ammunition, stockpiles that simply did not exist for any unit facing Moscow. An estimate suggested it would take at least 6 days for supplies to reach the 4th Panzer Group, after frost set in, delaying any offensive action. Back in Germany, a fresh round of infighting erupted. On one side, Hitler clung to the belief that Guderian lacked the bridging equipment needed to cross the many watercourses between his forces and Tula. On the other side, Hitler insisted that the 4th Army could take over the Tula operation in addition to existing objectives. He also wanted infantry from the 9th Army to replace the 3rd Panzer Group at Kalinin and then shift to a defensive posture. Panzer Group 3 and 4 would then merge to push on Lubinsk, Yaroslav, and finally Vologda. This stance clashed with the reality that the 4th Army was on the defensive and running low on reserves. Kalinin itself was besieged by Soviet forces, and the Germans could barely supply their own forces there, not to mention troops 250 kilometers further northeast. Hitler therefore pressed Guderian to abandon the drive on Tula and join the Voronezh offensive. Bock protested to halt her immediately. "I have no idea what the objective of the 2nd Panzer Army's departure for Vorozhev is. It is essential at Tula and further northeast. The situation is such that the southern half of the 4th Army between the Oka River and the highway has been forced onto the defensive by the increasingly strong enemy. Relief of the 4th Army and a possible resumption of the attack can only come through a continuation of the Panzer Army's advance through Tula to the northeast. Turning this army is unjustifiable." Halder appeared to side with Bock, but the very next day he sent orders to halt Guderian anyways. When Bock tried to pass the orders on, Halder refused to transmit them, forcing Bock to brief Holsinge. After reiterating his objectives, Bock flatly refused to relay the order to Guderian. Bock would write in his diary that day, "If the army command wants to do it, it will have to tell the Panzer Army itself. The advance by the Panzer Army, including its infantry corps, has been started through unspeakable effort and after overcoming great difficulties. If I now order it to halt, they will think me mad." Throughout the night of the 27th, telegrams moved between Bock's HQ and the OKW and OKH, each time Bock refusing transmission. On the 28th, the OKW and OKH finally conceded defeat and ordered Guderian to continue towards Tula, but with an additional instruction: cross the Oka River with a small detachment near Sebrukov. Following the incident, Kluge was ordered to fly to Hitler's headquarters to brief him directly on the frontline conditions. It is theorized that Hitler believed the OKW was deceiving him once more for its own strategic ends. Although there was no surviving meeting minutes, Kluge told Bock that Hitler had requested detailed battlefield accounts, including weather, mud, and road conditions. Kluge then spent 3 nights and 2 days at Hitler's headquarters. A key outcome of the meeting was Hitler's acceptance that Army Group Center's forces should wait for frost or dry conditions before resuming any major offensive, while still permitting local attacks and opportunistic advances, but not large-scale operations. Kluge spoke once more about the possibilities of attacking. He said that if he drove his forces forward now, there might be a gain of a few kilometers. Then that would be it again, because artillery and motorized weapons became stuck. I told him that there would be a gain of nothing by that. Naturally, we must stay alert to any weakening of the enemy and strike there immediately. But in general, the army had to, as per orders, make thorough preparations for an attack as soon as the cold sets in. This time benefits the enemy, but unfortunately there is no other solution. The situation is enough to drive one to despair, and filled with envy I look to the Crimea, where we are advancing vigorously in sunshine over some dry ground of the steppe, and the Russians are scattering to the four winds. It could be the same here if we weren't stuck up to our knees in mud. Plavsk fell on the 27th after a 36-kilometer sprint in 2 days, achieved despite heavy mud and scarce fuel, with German forces advancing faster than the Soviet lines could realistically form defenses. By the 29th, the vanguard approached within about 5 kilometers of Tula, and on the following day, the leading battle group, comprising 2 infantry battalions and 2 tank battalions, attempted to seize Tula. Soviet defenses were quite stout, reinforced in the days prior, and included anti-aircraft guns wired for direct fire alongside entrenched anti-tank batteries, which inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. This particular battle group at Tula depended entirely on airdrops for supplies, an arrangement unsustainable for any further buildup. The eventual capture of Tula remained contingent on ground frost hardening the soil and on near-term railway head repositioning to bring supplies closer to the front. The fighting around Kalinin continued through the week as Soviet forces pressed to complete the encirclement of the Panzer Corps defending the city, while German logistics deteriorated under mud and fuel shortages, limiting reinforcement efforts and keeping ammunition quite scarce, which in turn drove higher German casualties. The airfield near Kalinin had been closed due to excessive aircraft losses, further constraining airlift and resupply. The 1st Panzer Division was demanding withdrawal for a full organizational overhaul after heavy losses. The 6th Panzer Division was cannibalizing tanks to keep some in service as it pushed towards the city. And casualty figures in the Kalinin vicinity rose, with the 161st Infantry Division suffering around 2,000 losses, the 36th Motorized Division about 960, and the 129th Infantry Division about 550, all of which underscored the strain on German combat power and complicated efforts to break the encirclement or relieve the besieged units. The conditions surrounding the Kalinin sector prompted Strauss, commander of the 9th Army, to oppose Hitler's plan to capture Yaroslav, arguing that Kalinin itself was not a secure base of operations. Reinhardt, commander of the 3rd Panzer Army, disagreed with Strauss and pressed for an offensive start on November the 4th, a timetable that would have not allowed time for the 56th Panzer Corps or the 3rd Panzer Corps to arrive, leaving the already battered 41st Panzer Corps to advance roughly 250 kilometers in cold, muddy conditions largely on its own. Yet the 3rd Panzer Group was technically subordinate to the 9th Army, and Strauss promptly countermanded this reckless order, forbidding any of his infantry divisions from taking part in such an offensive. Even as Strauss worked to keep his forces from being drawn off to the northeast while trying to hold the army group's northern flank, Bock issued new directives that the north should be treated as a secondary theater, focusing instead on the 70-kilometer gap between Yaropolets and Kalinin, where no German units were stationed and where neither Strauss nor Kluge had stretched to cover the sector. Nevertheless, Reinhardt refused to participate in any operation unless it was directed towards Yaroslav, even in the face of Bock's intervention. On the 30th, a new set of orders from Army Group Center clarified the operational focus. Yaroslav and Tikhvin would remain targets for both Army Group North and Center, while the 9th Army was reduced to securing supply lines for the Panzer Group's push towards Yaroslav and no longer tasked with conducting an encirclement alongside Army Group North. The 4th Army was instructed to await an improvement in weather and logistics, then attack Moscow without delay. The 2nd Panzer Army received approval to cross the Oka River, and then was assigned to seize the industrial areas of Stalinogorsk and Kashira. It was determined that the encirclement of Moscow would require eliminating Soviet forces between Kalinin and the Moskva River. Operation Typhoon was declared at an end, with German losses in October amounting to 41,099 men. Total losses by the 6th of November was to be 686,108. 1 out of 5 soldiers who had entered the USSR in July were now a casualty. Like Operation Barbarossa, Operation Typhoon was successful in many tactical and operational respects, but failed to achieve its overarching strategic objective of winning the war. After Kiev, Hitler imposed a dramatic shift in German policy towards Soviet cities, forbidding assaults on the cities themselves or accepting their surrender, including Moscow. The October 12th order from the OKH read like this: "The Führer has once again decided that a surrender from Moscow is not to be accepted. Just as the most serious dangers to the troops in Kiev were caused by time-detonated bombs, the same must be expected to an even greater extent in Moscow or Leningrad. Soviet-Russian radio itself announced that Leningrad is mined and would be defended to the last man. Therefore, no German soldier is to enter these cities. Anyone attempting to leave the city against our lines is to be repelled by fire. Smaller, unblocked gaps that allow the population to flow out into central Russia are therefore only to be welcomed. The same applies to all other cities. Before they are captured, they must be worn down by artillery fire and air raids, and their populations must be forced to flee. It is irresponsible to risk the lives of German soldiers to save Russian cities from fire or to feed their populations at the expense of our German men. The more the population of the Soviet-Russian cities flees into the interior of Russia, the greater the chaos in Russia, and the easier it will be for us to administer and exploit the occupied eastern territories. This will of the Führer must be brought to attention of all commanders." Instead, the population was to be driven out or exterminated through artillery, air bombardment, or starvation, justified publicly by concerns over time bombs left by the Soviets and the supposed waste of German lives in taking cities. Civilians attempting to flee were to be shot unless they could reach special corridors eastward, and no food or firefighting assistance was to be provided to those inside the cities. The aim was to starve the 3.1 million Moscow population to death, reflecting a broader Nazi view that the urban populations were largely unwanted except for those who could work in the factories. The pre-war population had been 4.1 million. Refugees flowing into the city had outpaced the ability to evacuate civilians from the city until October. Only after October did the population start to decrease down to 2.1 million. The Nazis saw the urban population as a drain on food resources intended to ease long-term shortages, while rural populations were valued mainly for producing food or supplying raw materials. These plans reportedly remained unknown to the Soviets. Hitler on the 17th of October, with the Reichsminister, Dr. Todt, and Geleite Sakel, would say, "We shan't settle in the Russian towns, and we'll let them fall to pieces without intervening. And above all else, no remorse on this subject. We're not going to play at children's nurses. We're absolutely without obligations as far as these people are concerned. To struggle against the hovels, chase away the fleas, provide German teachers, bring out newspapers, very little of that for us. We'll confine ourselves perhaps to setting up a radio transmitter under our control. For the rest, let them know just enough to understand our highway signs, so that they won't get themselves run over by our vehicles. For them, the word liberty means the right to wash on feast days. There's only one duty, to Germanize this country by the immigration of Germans, and to look upon the natives as redskins." 8,000 kilometers of trenches and anti-tank ditches were dug to defend Moscow, complemented by 300 kilometers of barbed wire, with a semicircular main defensive line, holding a radius of about 16 kilometers, followed by 3 progressively smaller urban rings. In parallel to Kiev, civilian factories were repurposed to produce rudimentary weapons for local volunteer formations, and manufacture pillboxes and other defensive works. Many buildings were mined in anticipation of a German entry, and special stay-behind teams were organized to sabotage what remained or to assassinate prominent German figures. The city's airfields remained well supplied, and enabled near-total Luftwaffe superiority in the Moscow airspace. Yet forward German positions often lacked adequate flak coverage, and the Luftwaffe struggled to deploy enough aircraft to contest the Soviet air forces around Moscow. Casualties mounted steadily, with the 2nd Panzer Division recording around 100 casualties in just a few days. General Zhukov had ordered a summary execution policy as early as the 13th to, quote, "punish cowards and panic-mongers that leave the battlefield and retreat from their positions without permission." This hard line continued into late October and early November, with Colonel Kozlov of the 17th Rifle Division executed on the 22nd for retreating without orders on multiple occasions, together with the political commissar. Political commissars were tasked with assisting their commanders and chiefs of staff to reach appropriate decisions, and also ensuring that those decisions were indeed appropriate. They were intended to share full responsibility alongside their attached command for the condition and the combat activities of said command, establishing a joint accountability framework. Under this arrangement, a commissar was considered responsible for allowing their attached unit to retreat without authorization in the face of a no-retreat order, reflecting both the unit's operational stance and the political oversight guiding it. Likewise, Lieutenant Colonel Gerasimov was executed on the 2nd of November, alongside his commissar, for the same alleged offenses. Stavka had ordered the formation of 10 armies to be stationed inside the USSR, and by November the unseen structure was taking shape. 59 rifle divisions, 13 cavalry divisions, 75 rifle brigades, and 20 tank brigades. These formations were not rushed to the front lines out of desperation. Unlike earlier waves, each division was intended to be fully trained and equipped before deployment. The prolonged resistance around the Bryansk and Vyazma pockets, the stubborn mosaic defensive line, and the counterattacks led by Konev and Zhukov bought the Red Army precious time to assemble a brand new force capable of taking revenge on the Wehrmacht in the depths of winter. German military intelligence completely failed to detect this buildup, highlighting the strategic patience and evolving mobilization that characterized Soviet preparations during this period. German military intelligence in the USSR was notoriously limited and often disastrously ineffective. The only reliable strands tended to come from local tactical information about forces directly opposing German divisions, or from sources such as prisoners of war and defectors. Outside these narrow channels, German intelligence struggles manifested as broad misreads of Soviet mobilization, unit formations, and strategic intentions. It was contributing to missed warnings and delayed reactions during a critical phase of the conflict. On the 28th, the 1st Panzer Army sent a memorandum to the OKH stating that it was not in a condition to undertake further operations without improved access to supplies, and requested withdrawal to Germany so its tanks and equipment could be restored. Since only minor field repairs were feasible, and major repairs required factories or major repair centers. After 11,600 kilometers, the pure mechanical strain from the normal operation was starting to ruin many tanks and trucks beyond the capabilities of normal field maintenance. They needed a complete overhaul to restore them back to normal capabilities and reliability. The OKH, however, insisted on achieving the Makop-Stalingrad-Voronezh line by permitting a pause after the Don River line had been captured. The army was then ordered to renew its offensive towards Rostov in early November, but Hitler opposed even this concession, fearing the loss of the offensive momentum and the soldiers' reluctance to resume after the pause. Ultimately, a 4-week pause was agreed, though Hitler pressed that any snow-free period or frost should be exploited at all cost, with both Hitler and Halder aiming to secure the Don River line before the year's end. Many staff officers opposed this approach due to the crisis across multiple divisions, ongoing supply shortages, and high attrition rates. The Army Group had expected 724 trains in October, but they received only 195. And the 6th and 17th Armies found themselves operating at the end of barely sufficient logistical chains after securing their sections of the Don Line. All priority shifted to sustaining the offensive of the 11th Army and preparing a renewed push by the 1st Panzer Army, illustrating a persistent tension between aggressive strategic aims and the harsh realities of supply and maintenance under political military pressure. The Conference of Chiefs of Staff on October the 31st focused on the state of the 1st Panzer Army and the practicalities of reconstituting its equipment. The consensus was that as much equipment as possible should be returned to Germany for restoration, and that it would be wiser to halt Army Group South in its current positions, preserving strength for a renewed spring offensive, with fresh formations rather than pressing on towards distant objectives with divisions depleted to unusable levels. The Chief of Staff of the 17th Army warned that the Soviets might be attempting to lure them into a scenario where the German supply situation was so overstretched that a counterattack would be crushing, but this concern was dismissed by others. Halder noted in his diary, "The Army High Command no longer expects the greatly weakened enemy to take active measures. He will try only to withdraw and reorganize his forces undisturbed." Despite these internal cautions, OKH and OKW pressed for the army group to reach the Don River by the year's end, even though the staff officers argued they lacked the resources to adequately secure the flanks if the front extended along the river. They also asserted that any advance would have to be conducted with small infantry groups supported only by panzer wagons, with no motorization beyond those towing for anti-aircraft guns, reflecting the severely constrained logistical reality, and the preference for conserving forces until more favorable conditions could allow for a more robust, sustained operation. Halson's 54th Corps had been ground down by brutal assaults on the Crimean defenses, leaving them combat ineffective as the week opened. Kuznetov's 51st Army defensive efforts began to falter, and by the 28th, the Soviet defenders were pushed from their prepared positions, triggering a rapid retreat. This retreat fractured into two segments, with the 51st Army pulling back to Kerch and the long-standing defenders around Odessa streaming towards Sevastopol to brace for another siege. Manstein again faced a stark shortage of mobility, lacking motorized formations to exploit the Soviet route, and he reiterated the need for a mobile division, arguing that if the attack stalled, a corps comprising two panzer divisions and a motorized unit would be required to restart it. That demand, however, was denied once more, forcing his infantry to pursue the fleeing Soviets as best as they could. Consequently, the 54th and 30th Corps advanced towards Sevastopol, while the newly assigned 62nd Corps moved towards the Parpach Isthmus. The Romanian Mountain Corps took up the crucial task of securing the gap between these German formations against potential partisan activity and the anticipated naval landings. Just as the USSR's northern and central sectors appeared to stabilize, a fresh crisis began to loom in the south. The Romanian armed forces bore a heavy toll from the Crimean campaign, suffering an additional 10,000 casualties by the start of November, on top of what was already steep losses incurred during the Odessa fighting. This brutal death toll pushed Romania towards a more passive posture, as its military apparatus and strategic position were strained beyond endurance, and its broader role in the war appeared effectively exhausted. Disturbingly, in the wake of Odessa's capture, Romanian forces participated in acts aligned with the Nazi regime's anti-Semitic policies, reportedly shooting about 19,000 Jewish civilians in the city. One estimate was that 250,000 Jews and 12,000 Roma died in the aftermath of Romania's occupation of Bessarabia. Antonescu fully shared Hitler's mania about Jews and Bolshevism. Over on the Italian side, Mussolini's reaction to Odessa's fall was to elevate the sense of urgency and prestige by ordering the expansion of Italy's contribution. On October the 22nd, he decreed that 15 Italian divisions should be raised and dispatched to the Eastern Front. These were to be on top of the 92 divisions that the Chief of Italian Supreme Command, General Ugo Cavallero, proclaimed he would have raised and got ready for the use in spring of 1942. This is, of course, the same genius who, faced with a lack of motorization in the Italian army, ordered the daily marching distance of Italian soldiers from 18 kilometers to 40 kilometers. To say that Cavallero was delusional is an understatement. This directive came despite the notable contributions already made by the modest Italian SCIR, which, though small, had played a significant role in the invasion, including assisting in the capture of Stalino and parts of its responsibility for, screening the inland flank of the 1st Panzer Army. Hungary, by contrast, was already exploring ways to withdraw from frontline operations while remaining useful to Germany in its rear security role. The Hungarian Mobile Corps remained a valued asset for the 1st Panzer Army and the 17th Army even after intense losses, which helped explain why the Germans repeatedly refused to return the formation to Hungary until early November. When the Corps finally withdrew, it had suffered about 4,500 casualties and had lost roughly 90% of its tanks and 30% of its aircraft, a brutal toll that limited its battlefield utility. In exchange for its continued cooperation, Hungary sent 2 brigades to take on rear area of security detail. Meanwhile, Slovakia followed a somewhat similar trajectory, initially deploying about 41,000 men to the Eastern Front, but by the end of October, that force had been reduced to roughly 2/3, with many units being sent home. The remaining force was limited to a small mobile division, and even that formation was not regarded as equal to a heavily depleted German division, underscoring the shrinking combat visibility of Slovakia's contribution as the campaign wore on. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still looking for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or Echoes of War, my podcast series found on major podcast platforms. We're about to start a new mini-series covering the Battle of the Atlantic. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining the ranks on either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The Wehrmacht's longing for a quick triumph near Tikhvin in Moscow collided with a stubborn Soviet resistance, civilians marching beside soldiers and turning Despotsitsa into a title trap. Stalin shuffled generals shipping help to threatened frontiers, while Stavka plotted bold countermoves from Zhytomyr to Volkhov. Germans fretted over fuel, frost, and frail supply lines, while Moscow's defenders fortified with torches and resolve.